All right, well, let's pick up where we left off. So, we talked a little bit about some theories of emotions. Now, what is the function of emotion? Well, there are three different functions of emotion. So, one would be what we call an intrapersonal function. And so, that's the role that emotions play within each of us individually. There is also a very strong interpersonal function for emotions. And finally, at a social and cultural level, there are also important functions that emotions play or rules by which emotions must also play and respond. Now, when we look at how emotion functions within ourselves, there's a couple things. One, it first helps us to act quickly with minimal conscious awareness, right? When we experience an emotion, we don't necessarily think about what we're experiencing. We know that an emotion is associated with a very particular thing, right? We don't just hear something funny and think to ourselves, well, now I should probably laugh, right? Like it's something that happens very spontaneously. At the same time, if we feel fear, we don't think to ourselves, well, I should maybe go and touch that stray tiger or whatever, right? At the same time, this very immediate response allows and prepares our body for an immediate and coordinated action. So certain systems will get activated, others will get deactivated, will be ready to respond based on the emotion that we experience. Now, the other thing that's important or interesting to note is that emotions will also influence our thoughts. So, in addition to memories just being encoded, they're also encoded and connected with a specific emotion. And what we found is that it's actually easier to recall things that you learned in a if you're in a similar state to what that was. So for example, if every time that you sit down and you're watching these videos and learning this material, you feel happy and at peace with yourself and the world. Well, at other states in time where you feel happy and at peace with yourself and the world, it'll be easier for you to recall the information that you've learned from this class. Now, conversely, if every time that you feel mad when you're busy studying, you'll be better at recalling this information if you're in a mad state in the future. So, I guess what I'm trying to tell you is pick the right state for you to help with your learning for this class. Now, the other thing, too, that emotions do is that they help to motivate future behaviors. Now, here's a very true rule about humans is that we seek out positive and pleasurable experiences, and we tend to want to avoid negative ones. And so our emotions help us then to be motivated towards certain actions or not motivated towards others in the future. At the same time, there's a strong interpersonal function for emotions. So, one of the basic things that it does is it facilitates specific behaviors in people who are perceiving our emotions. So, it'll either tell them that we are safe, we can be approached, or it might tell us that tell them that we're a person that they should avoid. Specifically, if we're displaying strong emotions like anger or rage or things like that. Our emotions will also signal the nature of interpersonal reactions. So it'll tell us, tell the other person about the quality of our relationship, the seriousness, whether it's a professional or a personal or an intimate relationship. So emotions do a great job of helping to facilitate the context, the nature of an interpersonal relationship that we have with someone else. It also provides an incentive for desired social behavior. And now, this is an interesting little kind of concept, but it's this idea of social referencing. So, when we're in a situation when we don't know what we should think about something or how we should respond, one of the things that we tend to do is we look at the people around us, especially in an ambiguous situation, we try to figure out what should I do in this situation? Well, this behavior actually starts very, very, very early, and we actually begin to notice it in infants where they will begin to seek out information from others to clarify a situation and then use that information to act in a meaningful way. And one of the ways that we've demonstrated that this happens even in infants is through a specific experiment called the visual cliff experiment. And so I highly recommend for you to click on that link and to watch the experiment. It's a very interesting thing to see. But you can see the concept of social referencing. And this is something that remains important throughout our life. And so emotions provide incentives for a desired social behavior. And I hope that you'll see that and kind of make that connection when you watch the video. Finally, social and cultural functions of emotions include things like this. Our world is increasingly complex, and in any kind of group life situation, that complexity increases, 1,000-fold. And so, because of this, it creates the enormous potential for social chaos. So, one of the most important functions of culture is that it provides kind of a necessary coordination and organization for how we use emotions. So, doing so allows individuals and groups to negotiate the social complexity of human life in a meaningful kind of way. And so culture prescribes ways of meaning to each member of that culture. And with that culture comes certain rules about how we act in certain situations, how we don't act, the things we do and don't do, and so forth. And so when we think about emotions as a whole, right, we start at the level of group life. And the moment that we're in any kind of group life, social complexity increases, which means there's a need for social order. And through that social order, we develop a culture, a way of understanding meaning, and a way of sharing information. So within that context, we then also develop norms regarding emotions. What types of emotions are okay in our culture and what are not? And then we begin to teach people, well, culture, I guess, teaches people what are the reactions and the nonverbal behaviors that we have towards emotion. This then leads to socially appropriate behavior, which then decreases social complexity. Let's look at an example, okay? So in North America, one of the most complex behaviors, I think, for many kids is surrounding aggression. And in North America, this is an ironic thing. We love aggression and violence in our movies, but we do not like it in our kids. Interesting. Now, within our social order, within our culture, we have norms regarding emotions and specifically regarding aggression. And so when we see people who act aggressively, there are ways that we respond to them. And so some of those responses could be our emotional reactions where we say, hey, whoa, calm down, right? It can be nonverbal behaviors where we move away from them because we're signaling to them that they're not a safe person. Or it can even be some of the structural things that we put in place. So, whoa, like that's aggressive. If that's aggressive, that means that you're maybe bullying someone. So, therefore, now you've got to go to see the principal or your guidance counselor and so forth. And so, then this is how we then navigate aggression. So, with the goal then of our responses being that it's leading to more increasingly socially appropriate behavior, which then decreases social complexity, at least in this particular context. Now, you can apply this to any type of emotion and kind of evaluate it through a specific culture, but it's a helpful way for us to understand the role that culture plays in determining which emotions are appropriate versus inappropriate. Now, within cultures, one of the things that we're coming up with here, one of the things that I'm kind of bringing to the forefront is this idea of cultural display rules. And so that is that there are specific rules in specific cultures about which emotions are okay to be expressed and which are not. And we know that in different cultures, there are different rules surrounding emotions. So, for example, in many Asian countries, children are taught to mute their emotions, especially negative emotions like anger. So it's not very common for those types of emotions to be expressed. Whereas in other cultures, it is very common for aggression to be a normal part of emotional expression. We're going to take a straight detour here from that and maybe talk a little bit about positive emotions for a while, and in particular, this idea of happiness. Now, it is interesting to note that, our thoughts influence our emotions, and this can actually influence meaningful outcomes for us in the real world. So, one of the things that we know is that positive thinking can actually help us to manage stress in different types of ways. So, when we're talking about positive thinking, we're talking about this construct of optimism. And so, optimism is a general tendency to expect positive outcomes in life. And what we know from research is that optimists tend to be happier and they have less stress. That's great. Um, we're also talking, though, about this concept of self efficacy, and we'll talk a little bit about this in greater length in some upcoming weeks. But self efficacy is the belief in our ability to carry out actions that produce a desired outcome. We also know that people with high self-efficacy respond to stress constructively. So instead of, shutting down or kind of drilling down, what they will do is they'll seek out information, they'll talk to friends, they'll get the support that they need. And so positive thinking really relies on both optimism as well as self-efficacy. It's never just really one without the other. We need both. You can't just think your way out of a problem, but we also need to be using some strategies that help us to be able to get out of said problem. Now, Interestingly, positive emotions and positive thinking can actually be beneficial to our health. So, optimists make faster recoveries from illness and surgery in general. People with high self efficacy, they're more able to quit smoking, they're more able to lose weight. Makes sense, right? People who are hardy, they're able to cope better with stress and other negative life events. And the benefits of taking positive approaches to stress can last a lifetime and can be a very important factor for us. But here is the $1 million question. Is it possible for you to increase your levels of optimism, self efficacy, and hardiness? So the textbook is telling you, look at all these outcomes for these people. But the question that you or I need to know specifically, and particularly if we're not particularly optimistic, self efficacious, or hardy, is can it be done? Well, that depends on whether these constructs are traits or dispositional states. Now, what do I mean by that? A trait is something that's an enduring characteristic, feeling, or behavior, something that exists over time and is, in many senses, immutable, versus something that's a state. Is it a temporary behavior, a characteristic, or a feeling? Now, if these behaviors are states, or maybe if they're even on a continuum, then the answer is yes, we can in fact increase our optimism, self efficacy, and hardiness. But if these things are traits, then the answer is no. There's no way for us to improve or increase those things. Now, what does the research say? Well, over the last years, there have been several studies that have kind of shown that there are, in fact, ways for us to, increase optimism. There's a study by Duckworth and Seligman that found that self discipline actually outdoes IQ when you're looking at academic performance for adolescents. And grit or hardiness, that, Angela Duckworth's kind of work in this area has kind of shown that it is important and it is possible to increase our grit or our hardiness in particular situations. Now, is the research conclusive 100%? Well, no. There is a lot that we don't know, and even within the positive psychology literature, there are some areas of glaring contradictions, and there are also some areas where we're struggling with replication. One of the biggest problems, though, that I can see within the positive psychology culture is just that we're using a lot of terms like grit and hardiness and self-discipline. Are these things measuring separate things all by themselves? Are they measuring the same thing? Is there a better construct, or are we trying to take pieces of one construct and then kind of make them stand alone on their own? So the research from my reading of it says that yes, these are things that we can increase. We can increase our optimism, self-efficacy, and hardiness. But how those mechanisms function, I think we're still a little bit of a ways away from really understanding that in a meaningful kind of way. Now, it is also important for us to note that we do find happiness through our relationships. So happiness in and of itself, it isn't just based on our optimism and our self-efficacy. There are some genetic factors. Some people just seem to be a little bit happier than others. But there's also a strong social support context, which is important for happiness. Now, one of the things we know is that our perception of social support, so having positive social relationships and believing that we have positive social relationships, is probably the most important variable that influences happiness. I would actually argue, as a psychologist in practice, that the perception of social support is also one of the most important things that we can have for all kinds of psychopathology and other experiences as well. So, for example, married people report being happier than unmarried people, and people who are connected with and accepted by others suffer less depression, higher self-esteem, and have less social anxiety and jealousy. Okay, so social support is super important because it buffers us in a direct way. So, first of all, we have people that we can rely on that will help us, and secondly, it also has these appreciation effects of social support. So, having people around us makes us feel good about ourselves, and so it's kind of a self-reinforcing loop that's important for us. Now, what makes us happy? A lot of us would think that if I had $1 million, maybe I would be happy. But we found that material wealth really plays a very, very small role in that. So, after a certain point in time, money does not buy happiness. So very similar to, the ideas of of self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, after kind of meeting those basic needs for survival, happiness is something that's a much higher order construct, and so money generally does not buy more happiness. So what does make us happy? Well, the reality is we don't always know what will make us happy. Um, our own ability to predict future emotional states is usually not super accurate. It's been estimated that our wealth, health, and life circumstances only account for about 15 to 20% of life satisfaction scores. So that's a lot. It's about anywhere from 80 to 85% of happiness that is not due to those factors. That's a lot. The main ingredient in happiness really lies beyond these external factors. It's much more of an internal thing. And unfortunately, in this course, which is just such a snippet of little pieces of information, we're not going to be able to cover this question. But I hope that you will continue to to study and figure out what, in fact, makes us happy. I'm going to pause here, and we'll pick things up again in a minute.